study by the government and policy think tank says South Africa has entered a phase of ongoing violent instability as a result of what are ANC internal tensions. It says that these tensions have been causing instability in the country since 2009. One of the co-authors of the study, Ivor Chipkin, joins me now. Good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. I think more and more, research groups and think tanks like yourselves are pointing the link to the instability that we are seeing in this country politically that ultimately leads and, manifests itself in our social structure to stemming out of the ANC. And does that mean that effectively when we hear statements from the ANC like, if the ANC dies, South Africa will die as well, does it give credence to such statements?
Those sorts of statements are very dramatically framed. So it's not that the whole country will die, but I do think the ANC's internal contradictions and the violence and contestation that it's producing is able to generate an enormous amount of conflict and violence. And we saw that in July last year with call it as you want, an insurrection or revolt, which brought sort of the key parts of South Africa's economy to a standstill and caused over 300 deaths, I think it was. So astonishing violence which comes out of that internal contestation. I think what's important about the report, I should just note, this report is an outcome of a collaboration between the Institute for Security Studies and the Government and Public Policy think tank. So it's really a partnership project. It's not just our project. And I think the innovation of the project is several-fold. First of all, it's one of the rare pieces of work in the policy space or even in the academic space which has relied on large data modeling in order to make an argument. In most instances in South Africa, research is based on small case studies or even several case studies, qualitative research, which in and of itself is absolutely fascinating. But what is often obscured or left on the sides is a huge quantity of data which exists in South Africa and is available for modeling. So what we've done is we've taken this data and we've used it to try and understand these larger political phenomena. And in the end, what we've done essentially is to give credence to an argument that has been made for some time now, or the one which you've explored, but I think we've proved it. So it's an argument originally made by Richard Pitthouse and then Karl van Holten around 2010 that suggested some of the service delivery conflicts which they were seeing were actually related to ANC internal contestation. We have set out to explore that hypothesis, and I think we've largely proved it.
What kind of data were you using primarily for this research?
So I think this is where things get very, very interesting. So don't forget that in the main, service delivery protests have been explained not in terms of ANC internal contestation, but largely as results of service delivery grievances, or in terms of grievances around unemployment and poverty and those sorts of things, and inequality. Of course, those things are absolutely fundamental. But what we did was we had a database from the Institute for Security Studies on protest events, a fairly extensive database, which we modeled in relationship to data which we received from the police. The police have got a very large data set of events where police have been called out, and there's an international body which collects comparative data on protests. So we modeled all of that together, and we looked for patterns in the data and the trends in the data. And then what we did was we looked at the protest data in relationship to service delivery protests, service delivery events. So National Treasury publishes all financial data on municipalities. We took all of that data over the last 20 years of across 283 municipalities, 20 years of financial data, so a huge data set. We developed a proxy for service delivery based on sort of academic analysis of what's driving performance in municipalities. And we developed a service delivery measure, a service delivery proxy. And when we modeled the protest data in relationship to the service delivery data, we found actually that the correlations were very, very low. Very, very low indeed. Certainly not enough to suggest that there's any causality between the one and the other. We did something similar with the data around unemployment and poverty, and again, the correlations were there, but they were very, very low. We then built a large ANC database based on events, ANC events, constitutional events, elections, key meetings, key events in the media, people being discharged, corruption cases, assassinations, and we correlated that using a particular methodology with the protest data, and there the results were amazing, and the correlations were very good. And then what we have is we have a picture which is quite astonishing and quite unexpected. Can I tell you about it?
Sure, go ahead.
So what you see in South Africa is from around 2007, 2008, there's a dramatic increase of protests in the country. Dramatic. And many sociologists have written quite a lot about it. Kate Alexander, for example, and her team at the University of Johannesburg have done extensive work on on those protests, outstanding work in this regard, and published a lot as well. And and they were the first really to notice this enormous increase in events. But their work stops at around 2012, 2013. And what's interesting, from around 2012, 2013, in fact, protests stabilize. And they stabilize for a very long period. For a while, they decline, and then they rise, but they rise very, very slowly until the end of 2017. And then beginning with the Ramaphosa period, they go off the charts again. So there's this massive rise. So you've got a strange curve. It's a bit like a step. A rise, a stabilization, and then a dramatic rise again. So we were interested to try and understand that the shape of that data, that particular phenomenon. The stabilization period is completely counterintuitive because it coincides overwhelmingly with the presidency of Jacob Zuma. So this we now know, this is the period of economic crisis, of political crisis, of the crisis of institutions. You would expect exactly the opposite to happen. You would expect that would be the period when protest goes through the roof. But that's exactly what doesn't happen in South Africa. The opposite happens. There's a stabilization. So that is what we were trying to understand. And I think the explanation we've come up with, I think, is quite compelling, but much more work needs to be done.
It's interesting to me when you're looking at the issue of causality that you've effectively found that service delivery is not necessarily directly linked to protests, at least not for the bulk of the data that you are analyzing. And of course, the assumption is always that there's such poor service delivery in municipalities, which is why we're often seeing these protests. But the suggestion that you're making to us is that even where there are protests of service delivery, at the heart of it are political issues that you are now arguing could well be stemming from the governing party.
Yeah, I would frame that slightly differently. I think the service delivery protests are real, and the service delivery issues are real. I mean, we know that there's a real crisis in local government. But I think what's happening is that those protests are being absorbed into, or being captured, if you like, by internal conflicts in the ANC. So they're getting drawn into internal ANC conflicts. That's how I understand what's going on. And that's also why you see the stabilization, because the stabilization coincides with the period of state capture. So we think elites within the ANC are literally being paid off through patronage, which explains why they become less active, so less active during that period. The other thing which we find, which is alarming, is a huge rise in assassinations during that period. So protests are becoming more violent, but there's a huge rise in which coincides with that period of stabilization, with assassinations and other kinds of violence. What it suggests is that stabilization of protests is associated with growing patronage, growing corruption. Elites are being paid off or bought off through patronage, but also through intimidation, through violence. So kind of repression and patronage are explaining that stabilization of protests during that key period. We don't think Ramaphosa either has the will to use repression or the means to engage in the kind of patronage that happened before him. And as a result, that's why we think we've seen this dramatic increase in protest violence during his term.
All right, so much more that we could unpack further. Ivor Chipkin, let me thank you so much for your time. Some fascinating research findings indeed.